Before we start, I would like to take a moment to express our deep sorrows for the victims of this terrible disaster that has happened so close to us. It's the worst fire in 70 years, and so many people have died, and so many families have been affected, including people in our school. So please take a few moments to pray for them, and that we can be close as a community, and hopefully we can help them in their future endeavors. Thank you for that. We are here today to have the PhD submission by provides entitled Digital Commons, the role of immersive and gamification technologies in public space co-design. I'd like to introduce our panel. We have the main supervisor, Professor Hendrik Tiebet on Zoom. Welcome. Then we have the co-supervisor, Professor Jeroen van den Meijden. I can never get it right. This is good. I will be the chair, and also we have our internal examiner, Professor Mo Hashim. Thank you very much. We invite other people. I think we have a session that will last an hour and a half. We have the first session, which is an introduction and explanation to the thesis by provides. It lasts 30 minutes, after which there'll be a series of questions. And after that, we'll ask people to leave the room and have a deliberation. Over to you. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thanks for beaming in where you're from. I'm going to stand if it's okay. So hi, my name is Provide. I'm going to share with you my finding on digital commons, the role of immersive and gamification tools in public space co-design, supervised by Professor Hendrik, Professor Jeroen. So first of all, the research concerned itself with urban co-creation, which is a design approach that actively involves stakeholders in the design process to create more inclusive urban environments. And one of the challenges we're facing is to democratize complex design knowledge so that citizens can actually participate in increasingly digitized decision-making process. And all of this is framed by the participatory ladder, which is a model from which we can assess the participatory level of initiative. And that goes from manipulation, which is the lowest rung, to citizen control, which is the highest ideal level of participation. However, many initiatives operate in the real world, and if we operate under a false assumption about what makes ideal participation, it will make a disconnect between theory and practice. And so this study really wants to take an action research approach to try and see how we can localize co-creation model to Hong Kong's high density context, especially with the digital landscape. Which is why the key question that I wanted to respond to is how immersive and gamification tool can be effectively integrated in co-design methods to enhance citizen participation in public space design. Now today, hopefully, it's not going to be too clumsy, mainly in 4 parts. I'll introduce the gap in the expertise gap in digital participation. Then I'll describe my participatory action research methods, after which I will show a little bit the process of how I actually designed the sandbox game for a local open space in Hong Kong. We will show a bit of the workshop outcome, and finally, we will look at 10 observations, which is the finding of the collaborative dynamics. Finally, the discussion part is the key. We have a reflection with stakeholder on the findings. We have actionable insights from the different participatory action research cycle, and we also have the theoretical contribution on creativity, engagement, and collaboration in a co-creation process. So first, research gap. So what is the expertise gap? Traditionally, it was defined as the deficit in citizens' ability to participate. But in today's inclusive paradigm, it is redefined as the challenge for professionals to democratize domain-specific knowledge to the public and synthesize that with local lived experiences. And the potential of immersive environment is that it's able to visualize architectural knowledge in 3 dimensions. However, digital participation is bounded by who can participate, with what ability, how, and how will those inputs be valued in the system. And that's what we want to concern ourselves with. We've seen Google Sidewalk Lab, the ultimate digital participation. However, it was heavily criticized that it was harvesting citizen as a data subject. And so what we need to look out for here is the techno solutionism, which is taking technology as a solution to the co-creation challenge. And the key really, as proposed by Scholar, is how we can enhance digital literacy of citizens to understand information, manipulate information, and finally effectively expressing their needs through information. We've seen increasing efforts worldwide from Latin America, Europe, to the USA, using video game as a way to engage citizens. Some of them are built projects which are more practical in their game design. Some of them are playful projects which they try to engage in outside the box thinking for participant by playing in an infinite play. Some of them are more route-based. You have scenarios, and then you have to craft your architecture according to scenarios. And some of them are more about visualizing very heavy policy document for citizens to understand. So sandbox game is initially a type of video game without rules. On the other hand, it's more about players defining their self-directed goal in the social environment. This is to stimulate their creativity from user perspective, and also it's the ultimate participatory form of learning because no one's going to tell you what the route is. Instead, you have to learn through playing. And the key is to have a customizable piece of Kita parts. As you can see in Minecraft, they will have this cube, which we refer to as Kita parts that allow user to configure spaces through these components. And for this research project, there are two key characters of sandbox game that are important: being immersive and being gamification. First, it will become an immersive digital twin that replicate real world in a gaming environment. It will have a shared asset library, so all of the facilities that participants needed can be in that archive. It will be a network sandbox environment, so multiple people engage in a virtual space at the same time. Storytelling and roleplay is one of the ways in which participants learn about real world context in the gaming world. And finally, mission and reward helps them to understand what is designed in the process. However, there are also research gaps in using video game to engage citizens. First is about creativity, that the link between the Kita parts and the ultimate outcome of the design, the link between that is currently under study. Second is engagement, whether or not digital participation promoted more engagement or promoted exclusionism of a certain marginalized group is also under study. And finally is collaboration. How does different stakeholders collaborate with the digital interface in the process? That's also something that we wanted to find out. And of course, we want to localize that to Hong Kong's process. This is currently the participatory survey that the government conducted for a local open space in Hong Kong. Sorry, district open space. As you can see in the survey, they mostly take a bird's eye view, and it's comparing rendering with an existing image. And actually in this survey, I think more than 90% of people chose the rendering. However, does it mean that they actually understand the implication of that updated spatial design is the key question. So if participants only voted on a beautiful imagery of the design rather than the actual spatial implication, does it mean that the participatory level is as good as we want it to be? That's the thing that we wanted to challenge here. And the second thing is that actually more than 30% of local open space in Hong Kong is provided within social housing areas by the housing authority, which means that these would be the key area where in an aging environment, these will be the key area that support participants' social extension to their very limited living space. And also most of these spaces, a lot of them are built in the 1980s and they're housing millions of Hong Kong people. Right now they're meeting 50 years old. Participatory action research approach because it wants to localize the theoretical contribution of participation in local community contexts. And the key here is that we will have multiple cycles of action, observation, and reflect. And ultimately, the research should stabilize into an outcome that will be reflected with participant again. And this should tap into two key things. First is the global-local relationship, that the global theory feedbacks to hyper-local realities. And the second thing is situated authority, that every cycle, the researcher should reflect on themselves whether the research outcome are benefiting people and centering voices that are marginalized and important. And for that, we will have two key cycles. First is the participation cycle, that will actually work with local residents to shape the study scope, research gap, engagement method, and local needs. The second cycle is the action cycle, which will actually look into the data and analyze how we can understand creativity, engagement, and collaboration, and finally, the public space design in the digital participation process. And the stakeholder we concern ourselves with in this research, first of all, is the end user, who is the local residents of the public housing. Architect, designer, potential user of the system, social worker, and co-creators who are practitioner of participation. And in this process, we will actually go through theoretical contribution, studying context, crafting the method through the first part cycle, refining the research question, analyze outcome, and finally to reflecting the outcomes. Which is also the reason why my thesis is different from a general scientific thesis. We will actually have participatory outcomes, reflections, sandwiching the results in between. We have mainly 6 objectives. First, obviously, is to design a sandbox game. Second, explore how the game part stimulate creativity and spatial outcome. Third, how does the engagement is strengthened through the method iteration. Fourth, to develop strategies for multi-stakeholder collaboration. Fifth, to identify patterns in participant design for inclusive public space. And finally, to critically assess all of the outcome and synthesize the finding into actionable guidelines for engagement methods. This is also framed by an overarching framework that will be used to analyze the data. So again, creativity, we will look at spatial arrangement, technical possibility, activity scenario, and key part design. Participant engagement, we'll look at game design, participator experience, learning outcome, and co-creation results. And finally, stakeholder collaboration, we will look at people's work involvement, task role distribution, social participation, and interaction outcome. So overall, the 12 variables should help us to answer the 4 sub-question. How can participants' collective creativity be facilitated through different game system design? How can the use of virtual environments in a workshop process help improve participant engagement experience? What are the challenges in fostering collaboration between different community groups in a digitally assisted co-creation process, and how to tackle them? And finally, what are the inclusive approach to local open space design as participants attempt to resolve conflicting values into a coherent outcome? This is an overview of the workshop process. As you can see, the yellow parts are the intervention with the digital tool. And the overall process follows a design thinking sprint from problem identification, ideation, prototype, testing, and reflection. So participants normally work in small groups of 4 to 5, and there will be older adults, middle-aged participant, and youth working in the same group with designers. And ultimately, we targeted this local open space for a few reasons. First is density represented Hong Kong housing. Second, it also has a double agent problem that recently the government is trying to go into the district and renovate. Third is a modernist style, which means that it has left style building, tall towers surrounding a local open space built in the 1980s 10-year housing program. And this typical layout is seen in most housing during in the 10-year housing program. And finally, because of the topology of the space, it also benefits digitalization within a video game environment. For the event organization, as you can see, we try to balance gender, age, and people's role. And in each workshop, we have almost an equal mix of stakeholders across. And based on their background, they will be divided equally into each team. Each team will at least have a designer, a resident, a social worker, and a person with sufficient computer skills. Also, all of these participants are recruited by local community center and their experience with providing social service in the area. And some of these workshops actually happened during the pandemic, and so the participant number fluctuated, but it also reflected the reality of doing co-creation in real life. The key to the game design besides digitizing system process was the key parts. And the key parts was based on a survey previously conducted to gauge residents' preferences of spatial use. And as you can see, almost 19% is greenery, exercise, shop, and playground, and we actually follow this proportion to design modules that reflected those needs. And participants will be able to manipulate this module in sandbox environments. And during the workshop, participants will sit in groups like these. At least one of them will be making design decision in the sandbox. A second one will be reviewing the design decision in virtual reality. And a final one will be searching for the kit parts inside of space. And this was actually adapted from one of Professor Snibel's research work into this study. So we have 4 data analysis operations. First, when we try to look at the connection between game outcome and creativity, we do a thematic analysis to look at what were the discussion, and we match the transcript to the game design. Second, we did a semantic analysis of the interview and the survey. Mainly, we highlight the positive sentences and the negative sentences to understand what were the positive and negative side. Third, we do a behavioral mapping. So every 3 minutes, we will take a picture of people in the group, and then we will use a coding method from the literature review to see whether they're engaging with each other, whether they're discussing with each other, or whether they're disengaged, to understand at which point participants started disengaging. And finally, we will bring the design back to local community, and then we organize a review day where people will put their input into the design outcome, and we conduct a semantic analysis over the outcome as well. So a little show reel of the process. Yeah, so this is how they will work. They will first start off by communicating with each other their needs. They might use a physical or digital interface to compile those needs. They will then have a skill workshop to understand how to manipulate the virtual environment. They will get themselves used to the VR headset, and then they will also present their design using the virtual environment. And in the process, we've tried different things, including matching the physical input with the digital space, or entirely working in the digital space, and tries to look at different process. As you can also see, participants would be able to have a virtual site tour for those with mobility challenges, and they will have a full record of all of the analysis in the interface as well. Yeah, and then they will be able to compile the space together. So let's look at a little bit of the workshop outcomes. The first system we tested is what I call a modular integrated system. So this tries to interrogate the theoretical foundation of what it means by combinatorial creativity, which is the recombination of existing elements into innovative configurations. And while combinatorial creativity is well studied, individual and digital context and its dynamic in the collectivity is underexplored. And so for testing this kit apart, as a technical mediator, it tries to shape the combinatorial process with participants combining the preferences into limited space. This was the first phase results. When I first looked at the result, I was quite disappointed because I think it kind of shows that there were a lack of spatial orientation. First of all, they tried to pack as much element as possible into a limited space. And then quickly it became a number game because they realized that every grid is 5% of the total area. So the whole negotiation becomes how they can pack the most within, instead of looking at how objects are oriented, whether circulations are working. And so in the second phase, we tried the discrete system, which are self-similar elements, kind of like Lego. And it was specifically designed to incorporate elements that are easy to understand, and they're intentionally devoid of pre-designed functions. So it's abstracted from a real-world understanding to enhance the playfulness. This was the outcome. It kind of showed that participants are more conscious of the density between object and their orientation. As the modules are no longer integrated, the negotiation shift to how and where to place which element. However, there was also a challenge. It was a bit difficult to kickstart the process, as when they tried to understand what the elements were, it was too abstracted from the real world. And so we need to show a lot of example image to get them started. And also, after a few rounds, the outcome started to look repetitive in visuals as the game progressed. And then a third game system, we try to use more modular system. Imagine this as an IKEA way of doing things. And it's a medium threshold, which means that you need a little bit of knowledge to engage, but it's still accessible. And these parts were designed with simpler functions based on the survey, so it still reflect their uses of local open space. However, they have style differentiation, so we can see their preferences of color, texture, material, and so on. And in this gaming outcome, we start to see that they are considering the spatial characteristic of the local context. For instance, they will think that there's a tower here which can provide shading, and so they will put a stage here where people can enjoy events under shaded areas. They will have a centralized hub with the grass lawn so people can chill and relax and be able to look at their surrounding environments. They try to compile the exercise equipment with playgrounds so that different age group can enjoy activities next to each other. However, there's also a limitation, which is that when they try to localize the original idea into the plan, a lot of the elements went missing. And in this negotiation process, it was unclear how the first got to the second. And so in the next phase, we wanted to have a more structural approach to hybridize the system. So first, we borrow from an established framework of how you can rank local open space activities. And then we examine the relationship between stakeholder collaboration and their decision in the process. There was the gap between the intergenerational team composition and the shared participatory decision making. And so using this framework, we tried to guide how they can first choose their activity goal, develop the appropriateness of the project, consider interests of different age group, and then assess practical consideration before implementing the design in the sandbox. So this is the outcome of this stage. We can see comparing the two design. One of this was highly intergenerational, and one of this is moderately intergenerational, so only youth and designer. For the highly intergenerational, they focus on play and relaxation, they focus on social interaction area, they focus on greenery, and they have traditional Chinese elements. However, because they're trying to deliberate diverse input into a coherent design, the outcomes were more practical than imaginative. In the design, it was mostly youth and designer. They started getting very imaginative. They wanted to have water activities. They want to have interactive play area. They want to match an infinite sign with a pet area. They wanted a summer party atmosphere. However, the design was less grounded in real world needs, but more imaginative in its outcome. And so for that, in the final phase, we wanted to look at how we can frame that creativity, mainly from combinatorial to exploratory. What exploration means that you're trying to play within constraint and look at the limit of that constraint. And when applied to urban design, exploration creativity are often regarded as the creative complexity shown in professional designer pattern thinking, which is to play with the room. And so the final phase pushes the boundary of the system and tries to liberate more freedom for a participant in the process. So this is design A. As we can see that youth wanted companion pets and board games. Older adult wanted tea drinking and C2 opera. Middle-aged participant wanted to be able to stroll and have herb garden. We also have a wheelchair user who needed a run. And so finally, the design exhibit a combinatorial creativity as it synthesized all of the needs into a double layer inside-out design. We have the first floor with pet, tea, and situ, second floor with recreational and board game areas. The engagement level of the overall group is high. They're mostly engaging in discussion. However, within this reciprocal process, the tasks were mostly executed by youth, whereas older participants acted as an information provider. The second design exhibited exploratory as it tried to push the boundary within a limited space and is problem-based. Coincidentally, both youth and older adult wanted to have video game in the local space, and the challenge was how we can pack unlimited activity into limited space. So they created the infinite loop. This will be a symbol of the local community, but also an infinite track where multiple games can be played inside. This group engagement level was a little bit more quiet in the beginning, but in the end, their engagement were high, and they have a mid level of satisfaction. And the key here was that tasks were equally shared across members. So both older adults and youth participated in the game design. And there was a coordination in their role distribution that we realized older participants finished all of the tasks early, whereas youth members finished tasks last minute. And that created a little bit of communication problem in the collaboration. In a third design, they negotiated needs for the widest. That the youth wanted animation culture and Japanese style architecture, whereas the older adult wanted Chinese style architecture and they wanted simply a scenic garden hanging out. They tried to use combinatorial method to synthesize all of these in 4 levels. And even though they gave a lot of thought into how they can design each level, it also showed that it was a lack of synthesis in the overall activity on one level space. And in the end, actually, this group engaged in a conflicting situation. Part of the group started having subgrouping that stopped talking to each other. In a task, however, everyone maintained to the end. The executor presented, implemented till the end, and the satisfaction rate was high. And in the task distribution, youth was mainly leading technology, older adult was a provider of information. And in terms of role, the conflict partly came from generation, but it was also partly from a different social understanding of what activity is needed in local context. In the design D, there were only 2 members. The youth wanted more experimental space, whereas the older adult wanted more nostalgic space. And they resolved this by exhibiting a combinatorial to exploratory creativity. So what they do is that they design a flexible area that can accommodate the most diverse type of exhibition activity in limited space. And the engagement level was quiet at first, but in the end, their satisfactory was high. And for the collaboration type, we also demonstrated a reciprocal process. And in the final design, it was also an exploratory creativity as they tried to synthesize most very diverse type of community activity into limited space. They have this double loop typology where you have a central hub with flexible area, but you have a peripheral loop with more specific functions. So we conducted a thematic analysis of the design, and we realized that most of the participants were taking an inclusive approach, which means that they try to synthesize everyone's need into the design rather than taking a universal approach, which is a more traditional approach providing an empty space for flexible accommodation. And in the final review day, we have over 100 visitors contributing their input. They first listen to each of the design, they view them in Metaverse, and then they input their qualitative data. And from the results, they listed the pros and cons of each design, and then they preferred design E in the final process. However, an interesting point we found out was that most of their points were repeating what they heard from the presentation. And I think this was particularly interesting for the research because it shows that no matter if you use or not use digital technology, without a carefully crafted engagement process, they will be repeating information they're receiving. And so finally, let's look at the team dynamics. The first and most important piece of information I found was that the more stakeholder group we involve, the more stabilized the team perform. If we involve only one generation of people, some of the group will perform really well, some of the group perform less well, and the team dynamics are less stable. If we involve 3 generations, all of them are more stable. If we only involve 2 generations, the performance became really steep and their attention span is reduced. And in the process, we also identified that middle-aged participant disengaged the earliest. It shows 2 things. First, that the activity needs to be tailored to their needs as well. And then second, we need to have a clearer role distribution so everyone clearly understands what they're doing in the process. Third, while we're conducting the survey, we realized that the categorical variable largely comply with existing local space provision, and that was surprising because it kind of means that if no one's unhappy about what it's providing right now, what's the need for change? But when we look at the subcategorical variables, we realize that it doesn't comply with the overall category. For instance, in overall, we see that people want green space, But actually what they want is a space to study and work, like co-working space. They want to socialize with friends. They want to have a place to rest without paying. They want to be able to engage in board games, drink tea, and hang out. And so this shows that how participants proclaim preferences does not always correlate with their actual revenue. The fourth piece of finding was that involving more stakeholders also increases their satisfaction as well. However, if we're looking for practical outcome, involving more generation of people will be better. But if we're looking for more creative outcome, involving less generation can help kickstart that creativity. And looking at the effect of technology on the group dynamics, very sadly, when we use technology, we almost have to contribute double the amount of time. So to ensure the smooth process. However, we can also see that the attention span was expanded and also pushed later on in the process when people are more engaged with the tool. So it comes with both pros and cons. And also having no virtual reality might even promote higher satisfaction rate than having actual virtual reality. But no matter the game version, it was consistent that the more generation you included, the higher satisfaction they get, and the less generation almost have the lowest satisfaction rate amongst the whole process as well. And within the Sandbox Game Kit of Parts design, we try to consolidate all of them into a framework. So it can be a modular integrated approach, which benefit planning and space ratio decision. It can be the modular approach where a participant can understand a benchmark of architectural knowledge and focus more on the spatial quality. It can be a discrete system, which looks more like Lego. It's easy for them to get started. However, it's harder to ensure quality of the results. So number 8 is to actually look at how does the granularity, stacking method, and self-similarity benefit spatial arrangement, technical possibility, and activity scenario. So it was understood that the higher granular we have, the smaller the kit size, the higher the level of detail outcome. It will also need more time for people to create something. Self-similarity benefit their playfulness, however, hard to ensure outcome. Stacking method, if we have more regular stacking, it's faster for them to complete. They're also more open-minded. However, sometimes the outcome might be more repetitive in the process. And also looking at one of the key findings, which is how we can craft better engagement methods. So besides following the design thinking sprint, some things that we find very effective was the active learning components. For instance, think, pack, share, asking them to design self-directed goals, promoting friendly competition, and communication session to help them understand communication methods. And finally, is the minimum time that needs to be spent in each session in order to create meaningful results. And throughout almost 20 workshops, we realized that for the learning part, it's better to have 15-45 ratio, so then they only listen for 15 minutes and then they can have hands-on activity for 45 minutes. And if we minimize the hands-on activity for less than 30 minutes, then it'll be hard for them to have an in-depth conversation and being able to have meaningful outcomes. Finally is the conclusion. So in a reflection with stakeholder, we interviewed architects, institutional authorities, and workshop participants. What we found was that architects were interested in applying it in conceptual stage, design schematic, and post-occupancy. However, they were also the biggest critic of the project, and they think that once we started the tendering process, it's almost impossible to change the design, and they would prefer to not have so creative outcomes. For institutional authorities, it was a public housing authority that we interviewed. So they show us the 5 stages of the DBC process, and they like that we would have an idea bank that consolidate everyone's imaginative design into an archive. However, they would prefer to not have concrete design for them to follow, rather just an inspiration. And finally, is the workshop participant. They really enjoy the process of empathy building, cultural synthesis, and decentralized creativity. However, they also consistently doubt themselves in a process about technical proficiency, about time constraint, and about how deep their design actually reflects reality. And so with that, we have a session to consolidate all the design. And from the spatial topology, we can see that the central area, they prefer to have more relaxed hangout zones. And in the entrance area, they prefer to have more lively activity. And finally, in the back area, they prefer to have exercise spaces. And this typology, although following existing, there was a relationship between how different functions support each other, which is different from what we have right now. So a few actionable insights. The four criteria that participants came up with largely conform with existing theories. However, when we look at the conceptual tension, we can see that their approach was more course towards inclusive design, which is co-created solution rather than a simple broad spectrum design. And also the key contribution was that universal designer questioned practicality of participatory process, whereas inclusive designer would advocate for the co-creation methods. In the third and fourth part cycle, what we realized was that the designer role in the process. If designer assume a role of passive objective facilitator, then participants tend to focus on immediate needs over imaginative outcomes. And so what was found out here was that if we wanted practical results, it's better to have a rule-bound game system. If we want imaginative results, it's better to have an open sandbox. And finally, when we uncover user priorities, more than 10% was allocated to basic needs. Around 5 to 10% was lifestyle needs, and finally, the explorational needs. These also conform with Young-Gale urban need theory. However, if we look at a micro-level behavior, then we realize the discrepancy. And so we advocate that co-creation projects should always locate both the macro-level desire and micro-level behaviors. And finally, it's a theoretical contribution. So the killer parts must balance granularity, stacking, sense. And this actually came from a tradition of how we modularize architecture in the field. However, with progress from solely factory manufacturer centralized modules to the more disparate types, which are more Lego-like and easier for citizens to engage. And for participant engagement, we've differentiated 4 main types. Silo specialization is when different generations focus on their own task and not communicating. Reciprocal scaffolding is when older participant input contextualized youth skills. Role diffusion is when middle-aged participants sometimes disengage when they lack the anchor in the activity. And finally, task sharing is when all members equally share all tasks. And finally, it's about collaboration. So we realized that being able to have role complementarity is the most important. And that conforms with industrial organizational psychology theory. And also, it's important to design tasks according to these roles. And finally, technology is a moderator that strengthens the success, but is not an immediate mediator that helps to prevent groupthink. Finally, is the limitation. So there are 4 key limitations.
Try to wrap up.
Okay. In terms of the system, the research conformed with the ideology of citizen control. In the next step, we wanted to better reflect on whether that is the best approach. For people, the pedagogy of participation, we have to involve active learning components in the process, and mostly we comply with the abductive method. But in the next step, we also want to try the deductive and inductive method. The method were more focused on present needs. We would also like to test how we can incorporate speculative design in the process. And finally, is to really look at the latent value of co-creation if not all of the designs are suitable. So that's the final QA. That I think the contribution was 5 level to understand the long-year relationship between digital system and outcome. That we can combine workplace psychology with public pedagogy through serious game. We diverge from traditional workshop approach to challenge the assumption of design thinking model. We situated in the citizen science to involve the public as researcher. And finally, is to situate between the domain of building and the domain of infrastructure provision, which is the ultimate urban design. So the project advocate that in increasing digitization culture, experiences document can help to ground understanding of public participation, bridge technology and skills gap, and we hope to advance practices into a digital problem. That's the final slide. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now we have the second session, which is a series of questions. by our examiners. And first, I would like to ask our external examiner, Professor Schnabel, if you have any comments and questions to the candidate. Thank you.
Fantastic. Can you still hear me well?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, yes, great. Provide a fantastic presentation and really an exciting research you undertook there. And I'm really proud to see where things ended up. Uh, you really presented a very comprehensive study, and I liked that itinerary process which you engaged in, and which you also presented very well, sort of based on the Sherman's model with move, reflect, and I think that really helps in this process. Now, can I have a sort of a bit more clarity with you or discussion around the difference between participatory design and co-design?
Yes, that's a great question. In a lot of scholarship work, participatory design were equivalent to co-design. However, in this research, we tried to differentiate a little bit. Participation pertained to the participatory letter would simply describe the participatory level of participant. However, co-design is the actual design process that you really look at the quality of the spatial outcome. And the implication is that one looks at the intangible outcome of the process, for instance, people's engagement, and the other looks at the tangible result that the workshop tries to achieve, which is the actual spatial design. And this differentiation helps us to have a balanced evaluation method that looks at both the tangible and intangible outcome of the system.
Yeah, okay, that's very clear. Thank you for this clarification. The next point maybe goes a little bit in this co-design. You talked about the role play, and I wonder whether the role play is is that actually really possible for lay designers, where you put them, for example, in the task of the lead designer, uh, where they actually don't art design, right? They have a very different background than an architect or the real designer would have. Do you think that this actually is possible, or does it screw your outcome because the person will perform in a way how he or she thinks a designer has to be, rather than actually be a designer?
That was a great question. That concern itself with what we call the magic circle, which is the effect of people actually playing in the role. And you need to create what they call a state of flow, that people actually immerse themselves in the process. And actually, there was in the one of the key phases of the research, I dedicated a lot of time in it. But what I found that was really challenging, because people in the role playing process, participant needs to have the ability to really understand, for instance, empathize with the role of designer and understand the professional task. And second, they need to be able to act out that role. And so acting is a totally different skill. And finally, they need the belief that they are really immersed in that role and jump out their own needs or their own thinking. And that actually need a totally different set of skills than just playing the game, but to really spend time to immerse in the process. And currently, my result doesn't show success or failure in the role play. So I don't have enough evidence to actually put forth a really good answer. But what I can observe is that the time needed to role play is directly correlated with how the game system needed a full narrative embedded in the process. And so that could be one of the next steps that I need to look into, of how to design the narrative of the game system, so to kickstart the role play better.
No, I mean, that's great to acknowledge that, because I think this is it's obviously a problematic situation where you put people into a role and not actually genuinely be part of that and be able to perform from their own perspective. Yes, in the same context, I mean, you touched upon it in your presentation already. the technology obviously plays a very crucial role of what people do and how they do it, and that you presented that and you refined the things, right? Now, do you think that the influence of the role, the digital, right, and what you can do in the digital versus, let's say, a physical model also has a tremendous impact on the outcome, or is that just like it does not really matter?
So in the first stage of the research project, because it was the pandemic, the entire process was digital. And in the later stage, because the pandemic ended, we do a hybrid, we have both physical and digital. And the analogy was that from both observation, we can realize that in the hybrid process, people form a more tighter bond in the co-creation process. When it's only digital, the bonding came much later on in the interaction. And so I think that can be used as an insight to understand whether digital and physical model would have a same collaboration effect on people. That for physical models, the communication and the bonding would be more direct, but for digital models, the communication and bonding will be delayed and pushed later on into the interaction process.
Okay, right, yes. I mean, that's an interesting comment you make that the pure digital is a very different and a different outcome, a different engagement than the hybrid mode. Yes. That plays maybe a little bit into also your sort of your framework of the participatory action tap it's called participatory action methodology. Yeah. Can you speak a bit more why you use the PAR versus any other frameworks to engage in that? Regulations, passengers.
So a large part of the research is about learning through doing, and it's not simply for the participant, it's also for myself, because after we push out the first game version, the result was disastrous. And so it was very immediate that I realized we needed a research method to frame it that can help adapt the whole engagement iteratively. And so that's when I came across participatory action research, which was perfect for the requirement of the study, which is to able to adapt participant feedback in the game design iteratively and to observe how the game will affect their behavior and thus adjust the engagement method to that. So that's the reason.
All right, that's okay. That makes sense. Now you looked obviously at the Hong Kong context, which is very unique. Do you see that this whole project would be scalable, let's say, to other areas in Hong Kong? You know, if you look at, say, Hong Kong Island, the open areas are very different, or to a very different city or different environment. You can go as far as Europe, or just somewhere else in China. When you see them.
Yeah. Actually, when we started the session, I think Peter also mentioned we had a great fire yesterday in Hong Kong that was pretty heartbreaking. And that building actually was also in the double aging context, and it very much represents Hong Kong's challenge at the scale of the challenge, which is that in 30 years' time, 30% of Hong Kong building will be above 60 years old. And all of them are in the need for renovation. So I think the participatory system would at least be replicable to those buildings and to those people. And whether or not it will also be replicable in longer time frame for buildings that will age 60 years in 50 years, I think that could be something that we look into. And on the second hand, which is to international context. So for places that are also facing double aging and ultra high density, like Singapore and Tokyo and Shenzhen, I definitely would be interested to try and scale and apply the method to those contexts and see whether it will comply with the results.
Because I mean, if you, for example, mention Tokyo, I mean, they also have the high density, but not maybe the density in terms of the vertical. It's much more low rise, but dense. Right? So I think there's different environments, urban environments, and that's for me the question: whether a really different buildings environment topology whether that has an influence on your research. On both sides of the aircraft with 10.
Sorry, what was the question?
Okay, whether the urban topology, right, high-rise building and so on, whether that has a big influence on your research versus if you go to a high density but low rise environment, let's say Macau or even what you mentioned, Tokyo is actually a very low rise environment, very dense. So the topology is very different from your side.
Yeah, I think that might help relieve the constraint of the game system actually, because now we've the varied community needs would be lower, I imagine, to be packed into the same amount of space. So that is one of the direct influence I can imagine.
Now, if you reflect on your PhD sort of a little bit, you have distance to it. I mean, a little bit. Um, is there something where you would say I would do completely different if it's in the next round or in the next iteration? Would you, or is there something where you say I learned from that, where I take away and I say, well, that is really a very good insight for the follow-up studies?
I mean, train in architecture, I think we all hope that the design can be built and benefit the larger community. So if there is a next stage, I would really just have the regulation and the brief visualized in the game. And I would try to do a participatory budgeting system where participants can see how much cost will actually be directly associated with the component they put in the space to help them understand better.
Okay, right. Do you think that your research can lead to influence policymakers?
So after reflecting and interviewing with them, what I gauge from current situation is that co-creation initiative needs its own co-creation policy. Within the current tendering process and procurement schedule, it's almost impossible that clients can give more than 2-3 weeks of engagement processes. And so if I can have influence on the policy outcome, what I would advocate for is to really put together an expert panel that will craft a co-creation policy tailored to double Asian context. You're muted.
Yes, thank you. So did that policy, would that then go towards sort of urban planning? Would it go focus more towards developers and say, okay, there's incentives? Do you see that goes more, let's say, to the housing authority, which has its own set of rules, you could say? Where do you see would be the first point of contact to incentivize people through this policy that they actually do engage in that?
Actually, during the stakeholder interview, where Professor Mo was involved, we also briefly discussed that if this become a checklist that people have to take boxes, it might actually promote more negative outcome where developer are simply trying to fulfill a certain criteria rather than enhancing the quality of the actual space. So learning from gamification theory, both reward and punishment are important in the process, but we should be rewarding qualitative criteria. And so for that, instead of the urban planning, which is also important, urban design might be the more appropriate field to actually incorporate some of these policies.
Okay, well, that's interesting. Because I was thinking that there would be maybe also some incentive for developers if they would engage in that. So, but that's very interesting you say that. Right. Yeah. All right, perfect. Well, that's everything for the moment from my side. I really enjoy discussing this topic. I know there's endless more to it, and there's never an end to this kind of research, especially because you go through iterative processes. But I really enjoyed reading your thesis. There are a couple of things where minor things where I would have comments, but I want to leave some space for the others to comment.
Thank you. I enjoy reading your papers too.
Thank you, Professor Schnabel. I think now we go to our external examiner, Professor Bo, and we'd like to hear your feedback and comments.
Thank you. Mark has already mentioned a very high level discussion on what your research is about. And I appreciate the whole efforts or a lot of efforts for conducting all the workshops engagements and so on and so forth, right? This is very much evidence in the dissertation. But I would like to be a little bit kind of bad guy to talk about like something that I feel may not be affecting what you have done, but in terms of how to craft your dissertation, that could be something that you can work on, or in order to make it an even more kind of a greater contribution or to or the field that you're working on. First and first, so the research question, I understand that that's kind of an iterative process. So you have a preliminary research question, which is sets out very clearly what you are trying to do. To me, it's pretty much focusing on what you see as unevenness in terms of digital literacy among stakeholders, and how that unevenness would impact on the co-creation process. Let's put it like this. Right? Then later on, you develop further and looking into most of the parts I agree, but intergenerational parts, I feel that it's a bit ad hoc to me. And of course, we could sort of understand that that could be something or has something to do with the PAL process, right? So the participatory action research process lead you to, and also the opportunity of the project leads you to something that you embark on and embrace it, right? So that's where the problem to me is. So the digital literacy among stakeholders is very clear. So you have the professional, you have the tech guy, you have the lay person. Within the lay person, you have different so people from different background, or so the more kind of well-educated background, or the more kind of socio-demographically more disadvantaged people. We can expect something that maybe the disadvantaged people would not be sort of easily pick up all the skills and all this kind of understanding, right? So this kind of unevenness will be actually quite interesting to delve with, right? And among the professionals, you have the social workers, you have the designers, and I could almost say like the students could be the professional. So I mean, within that, then probably we can also understand well, or their understanding of how this kind of digital tools would mean to them, or they would mean very different things, right? And also the tech person as the mediator of the kind of bridge of the two things, so to say, right? So there are gaps between different layers. If you focus on those gaps, that would be actually quite super interesting, and also will create massive contribution to this field. But later on, you drag, or maybe the project drag you, to develop an angle on intergenerational sort of understanding. And that's why we can also see quite a lot of like featuring of the findings. It's about like how different community members, different age groups come together and work together and develop the results and design, so on and so forth, right? To me, basically, they mean very different things. So the first thing is very, very straightforward and also very, very robust enough. The second, which is the intergenerational thing, which is a kind of a collaborative process. So the question to me, the question is entirely could be entirely different from what we have in the first place. Yeah. Of course, there are also chance like it's actually very easy fix. If I were you, I would just brand them as community, a slave person, rather than very detailedly segment them into different age groups. Or the reason why is that when I read through the dissertation, I don't see how the consensus building among age groups happen. And that's to me is the most important bit about intergenerational divide. because we have different views, right? We have different preferences. And it's so interesting to see maybe how the digital tools enable them to synthesize and reconcile the conflicts, and also maybe to synergize things, that's the how different value and come together into a proposal that may not be real, but at least we can see through the process how this consensus building is facilitated by the digital tools. And if that's the case, then probably that may not be addressing the actual or maybe the preliminary research question, right? Which is the digital literacy like gaps between different layers, right? And that's why I feel sort of when I read through, I enjoy the effort, but when I read through, it's almost I feel that a little bit confused of what you're trying to tackle with. And that's why I feel that when you and I was actually quite looking forward to the presentation, right? Then I kind of confirm with what you want to do, which is the digital literacy part. And that comes to a problem. How do you frame the whole dissertation then? Right? So this is one of the main question to me, and you can respond first. That is not too difficult. Thinking about the answer.
Yeah, so the key question was how to enhance citizen participation in the process where literacy and knowledge gap was a huge part of it. So throughout the PAR process, the digital tool sort of moves from the role of beginning the question to the actual moderator of how to strengthen success of the process. And so the question shifted a little bit of how we can help people use the tool to what role the tool actually play in enhancing knowledge. And to investigate how people actually learn to play the tool was then not so much focused on, but focused on the learning outcome of the process. So I definitely think that could be a limitation as well, because it was almost taken as a given that the tool would help with the learning. And then maybe if there is a next stage, there should be mechanism that actually observe how the digital literacy was rich or not rich. That could be an important research gap.
The reason why I asked this question is when I look through the literature review, I mean, usually the literature review will help us to create the research question, which is a framework or for us to understand what you're trying to tackle with. It could be more porous, meaning that because we have the PAR process, right? So there should be a certain flexibility to expand or contract, right? But I feel that in the preliminary literature research or literature review, we didn't set up it in a very robust way, so that it creates almost too flexible sort of framework. So that when the PAR process comes in, the research question or the research energy goes into other sort of fields. I mean, to me, it's actually very easily fixable in a way, because the first chapter is always something that we do it the very last phase. So we come back to the literature review and to sort of reshape it a little bit, right? So that's why I feel that it's not it's nothing we're into, but it's something that maybe in the next maybe that's we still need to discuss, right? But perhaps we need to improve on that, so that you can frame the whole dissertation in a much more shape way. Anyway, let's put it like this. So the second, well, you said about your contribution is in terms of the theory, it's about like citizen participation, all this thing, right? So I guess that's another thing that you can also contribute. which is the PAR approach. So the participation as a research, as we can see, without a very robust setup of research framework, that could also have another effect on the research, right? And there should be a certain limitation, but there are also measures to mitigate such limitations, right? So perhaps we can also set aside a little bit, or in the end of the dissertation, to reflect on this PAR journey. And that could be an interesting one, or that could be an interesting one. And if you're interested in digital literacy, I wish to have a much more expanded literature review focus on that. Because that I can sense that that is really your thrust of your research. And if you can do it well, then it becomes very, very interesting. So the other part, which is I feel, when I read through the dissertation, I like the kind of process or sort of exhibition, the showcase of the whole process. But to me, I feel that if this is a dissertation, then we wish to have it framed in a much more clear way. Then perhaps maybe something to consider. The design process, some of the content, you can almost put that as an appendix. So that, of course, we get, as architects, we get to identify and also attach to what we have done, right? But this is a dissertation, right? This is a research, right? So that's I feel like writing a research paper, like writing a manuscript for journal submission, right? Similar. There are lots of things that we wish to show, but perhaps we don't want to encroach the main content and to keep it in a much streamlined or light way, right? So some of the content is better to put that in the appendix, and that will actually give you a much clearer structure. Right? Then you can actually bring the preliminary research question and the later research question all together in one single chapter, and you just talk about how you develop and what you have done to go through in order to come up with the refinement. Yeah, so basically, so this is what I feel could be the most important question that I have when I read through your dissertation.
Want to respond, or are you okay?
I will just do what Miss Professor will suggest.
Okay, we can discuss. Just,
now,
to your supervisor.
Now, just because we're running out a little bit of time, I think just before we pass over to the supervisors, I'll just say a few words as chairman. Are you okay, Mark, or you want to say something?
I think he has to go.
Thanks, frozen though.
Mark, you want to say something?
Can I think about? Yes, yeah. Can I add something to most comments? I really appreciate the detailed feedback, and many of the points are I support in this context. At the same time, I believe that the thesis is actually pretty ready, and there's always a different version and a better version, and it's an itinerary process. So I don't see that there is the big need to really a substantial reorganization or rewrite of that of your work, because it's very clear and it's extensive. One can see whether the one part or the other part can move into appendix or bring out a bit more clarity around it. But I think overall you actually nail it very much, and it just becomes very clear what your research is, what your journey is, and what your findings is about it. So I feel that any changes are really just minor touches rather than really a substantial reorganization.
Thank you, Mark. So, as chairman of this session, I think the first thing that's important to say is, we and I've been part, and the school has been part to your journey, and I think it's been very nice to witness the sort of your passion that you have to the topic, and how by osmosis that passion is passed over to the school, through your interaction with the program, but also your interaction with the MARC. And I really see that you have this awareness and passion to empower through this medium. And so for that, I would like to recognize that just as your contribution to the school. Second point is that my angle is slightly different. Obviously, it's not my field. And so when I read it, and I must say, the clarity of the thesis increases. At the beginning, I found it a little bit difficult to follow. First chapter for me is difficult. And as you go forward, you clarify things. So I think the first chapter for me would be maybe even the language, which sometimes I found a little bit tricky to follow. But in it, I was thinking of the conversations that you bring to the school that I've been witness to when you hear, and a little bit showing sort of my education as an architect. I'm constantly aware of this kind of what I call the digital hegemony. And to me, it's very important. I have a kid who's 11 years old, who obviously is embedded into this world of Minecraft. And I find it very contagious and very strategically empowering in ways that are dangerous. And you look into Minecraft a little bit, you see that it's governed and controlled and owned by Microsoft. And the sort of manipulation that these huge companies have on the way, not only that we design, but on the way we live. So, and my question to that is then, how much of Microsoft is controlling the generic design that comes out of this? And not to say whether it's good or bad, but to have a position of you talking about it in your thesis, I think is important. And it's important because the way I was educated was, in urbanism, was something called collective memory. And the collective memory is the city that we live, the city that sort of is layers that we engage with. And I think Hong Kong has an incredible amount of collective memory. And, I don't want to go back to the analogous city that Rossi talks about, but I think it's important to realize that we are part of a historical legacy. And therefore, what's the role of the collective memory versus, the toolkit that Minecraft gives you? I think it's something that we have to ask the question. So that's the first question I'd like to ask you. And the second one, I'm very interested, and I engage a lot in participatory action research, but of course I come from a different angle. And that angle is different tools. And those tools are physical, those tools are engagement. But I think we're looking at the same thing, which is trust. And I find that the trust is always in the moment of translation. The moment that we translate things and help people translate. And I think your thesis is a thesis of translation. And so I would just like, and I think you touched when Mark asked you the question, whether the physical or non-physical, I would like to ask you about the act of translation, because I think a little bit different to Mo, I think that the outcomes that you've produced are very interesting artifacts to comment about, because they lack a certain something, which, being an architect, we have a certain lexicon. So they lack the sort of abstraction that a plan has. But yet, as an architect, we can comment about that and look and say, not that they're naive, but what can we learn from it? Why does someone want the Chinese pagoda compared to the sort of Japanese temple? And I think I would, if you have time, I think to conclude, criticality, your critical position, because the methodology is so strong, I would encourage you to be maybe more critical. So if you'd like to respond to that, and then we'll pass over to the supervisors.
Yeah, I definitely, it's a very valid comment. When I did one of the GRF proposal with Jeroen, it was exactly the comment that the reviewer gave back, which is the criticality towards the tool that inherently promote biases and exclusion, but you're using that same tool to try and promote inclusion. So the key was, what were the marginalization that you reproduce in that process, and how to identify or to some extent measure that. And that part definitely, I think, is a homework that needs much more investigation as we all progress into the digital age. Which is why the participatory letter was then incorporated as a way to measure whether it was true participation of all members of the group or whether or not there were subgrouping that certain members were marginalized. But definitely, I think that part should be further investigated of when that situation happened, what could be principle for a designer to follow as action path. That could be a great next stage of the work. And finally, to translate the digital and physical was also one point that I struggle with a lot because as also Professor Mo pointed out, maybe these designs are not built. So what are the knowledge that get translated if not built? Which is why the analysis consistently goes back to the transcript when participants are negotiating to try and identify, okay, what they actually wanted, and did the design finally synthesize all of them, all of what they wanted. And because we work in small group, so in the current lab setting, it wasn't that difficult. But I can imagine that once we go into the real world and you have to take in 200 participants mandated by the authority, then this could become a real problem in the process. And so there also needs to be guideline over how we harness the perspective as well. Yeah, that is an important part.
I think, and I agree, and I think I think you're touching at the root of the problem in a sort of primitive sense of how design happens with people. But I think we suffer the same problem when we're in school. I mean, we see that most of the designs that we have are generated by Autodesk and not by the students, right? Because of software has become so powerful, you know, and if you use Grasshopper, if you use, you know, any of the softwares that you have, you go through every school in the world, and now it's kind of ubiquitous kind of design. And I think what you've seen with the participatory design is the same things. If you did the same exercise, I reckon in another place in Hong Kong, it would be very similar because the tools are very similar. So how could we avoid that? Okay, so now I would like to ask Professor Thieben if you have any comments or feedback. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Provides, for the great presentation and also the comments by Mark and Mo and Peter. I mean, probably for Jeroen, we were with you through the whole journey and so on, and had a lot of discussion. So I don't have so many things to say at this point because no, we can see a lot of kind of qualities in the work, and also I agree with Peter that it was fantastic to see your passion through the whole process, and also how you try to bring this into the school and contribute and so on. No? So that's great. And we sometimes had discussions about the kind of the quality of the designs and that come out, and how do you really use them in the further process and so on, and what does it actually mean that is produced there. And I find what Peter was saying, the kind of criticality maybe also of the means that particular softwares that you use and so on. On one hand, I think it's good that you use Minecraft and so on also, because we talked about it because it's out there, and organizations like UN Habitat and so on work with this. But at the same time, also they have their own kind of shortcomings. Same with this kind of toolkit idea and so on. So it's understandable that you use all this, but at the same time to also reflect about it and to see where's the limitation, or also maybe in the future how other maybe layers in the design could be brought in, other aspects, no, or how materiality, other things, experience that are missing in this process can be brought in or combined. No, another thing that I felt, and that goes in the direction also to Mark's comment. I still could imagine that actually there might be all kind of other applications in this kind of work that might be beyond those things that we have even in mind now. If you would work probably with certain kind of either software industries or other forms of clients or slightly different setups or for example, using these tools in particular kind of either crisis situation or in situation where you need the digital, like for example, the pandemic, sometimes we couldn't come together, and then what is it? No, because then it also there might be certain situations where it's kind of very important to have this, no? Or other thing, at the moment I work here in Brazil with this amazing team of people, and they have a lot of experience. I would love to work with them on a project in Hong Kong, because they did a lot of things in the favelas and so on, and I have like 20 years of experience in informal settlements. Imagine then maybe how could we, and with these technical tools, we run these kind of online workshops together and so on, right? So how could we, maybe there are situations that where these tools are even much more organic to use and so on, that not at all as a critique of what you're doing. So I think you've done that, and there was your PhD and so on, but just in the maybe as a reflection and so on, or maybe start to for yourself also to switch gear and to say like, oh, now for a book later, or what you could do with this, because I guess there's so much more you could do with these kind of experiences, no? But that is not to say that whatever you did is wrong, but more like to step back and understand, oh, what does it actually mean, no? Okay, maybe I stop here, because I think it's more important for the external internal examiners and for Peter maybe to comment, and we already commented often, no? And maybe afterwards also.
Thank you.
Maybe.
Still had 100.
Would you like to say something? Okay, and then maybe just finally we have Jeroen.
Yeah, I'll leave it really short. I think we running out of time. I really appreciate all the comments. Made a lot of notes. Work closely together with Provides for this whole journey has been really fun and interesting. I think the overwhelming quality for me of the project is that it's really very ambitious, quite broad in a way that reflects the complexities of teaching urban design or dealing with urban design problems. There's almost too many issues going on at the same time to really identify clearly one issue that you're going to sort of measure, right? Because everything affects each other. I think that's maybe a bit of a weakness, but also a strength of the project, that it kind of just identifies that complexity and sort of lays it all out. It's a little bit of a sort of smorgasbord of a approach, but there's something about digital literacy, something about intergenerational, something about using VR or on-screen interaction, human computer interaction, right? And each one of those could be a PhD on itself, and somehow you chose to try to sort of a project which focuses kind of on the interplay between all of those issues, and then also really involving the stakeholders' voices themselves directly, right? To comment on how they experience those complexities and whether they find these workshops fun or frustrating or annoying. And you kind of just wrote all that down. That is kind of a very interesting process to analyze quite meticulously. In some of the papers you already published, right? That's the main focus on how the users actually experience these experimental workshops. I do very much agree that it would be great to pick up some specific issues and still turn that into a very precise paper, for instance, on the human-computer interface issues or the digital literacy aspects, how people actually learned to engage with the complexities of urban design as laymen through using the workshop process and the tools and the instructions and the constraints they were given, right? And how that sort of helped them to form consensus or at least some kind of solution which is the least objectionable to different parties in the process. Is for me, the most interesting part is that this is in the context of very high density pressured places where not everyone can get what they want. Somehow these platforms could help a more sort of friendly and informed debate rather than just people fighting and trying to pick a winner and that they get what they want and the other people lose, right? And at the same time, then it pushed something beyond the sort of standard parts that currently is in place. It's more about limiting liability and risk and accidents and things that way. So how this process could still be optimizing something, but at the same time, maybe think a bit outside of the box of the current public space provisions. There's many potential ways to frame the contribution of the project. But yeah, it's been really fun and I really enjoy it, and we can keep talking about the next steps.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you, Ruben. Thank you, provides. Thank you to all the examiners. Thank you, Mark. Hope you're still with us. Now we're going to ask everyone to leave the room and we're going to deliberate our thesis. Thank you very much.